Welcome to the Friendly Podcast Guide, sorting through podcasts so you don't have to. I'm Andy Smiley, and I want to help you discover the right podcast without having to listen to an entire episode. Now, let's talk podcasts. Hi there, welcome back. The Kids Short Stories podcast is a staple at our house. So let's just say when I was talking to Mr. Jim, the host of this kid podcast, I felt like I was talking to a celebrity. My kids definitely thought I was super cool that day when I told them that I got to interview Mr. Jim. Before we hear my conversation with Mr. Jim, here's some details about the show. The show description is, at Kids Short Stories, we engage kids through the power of story and equip parents to let their child's imagination run free every day. The length of each episode is about 10 minutes long, and it is completely kid ear friendly. The series is ongoing with new episodes available every day. Before we learn more about the vibe of the show, we're going to take a quick break to talk about the Friendly Podcast Recap. The Friendly Podcast Guide officially has a newsletter. How exciting is that? I'll drop into your email on the first Wednesday of every month to give you a quick recap of the episodes that came out the previous month. All the discount codes from my partners I talked about in those episodes, and some episodes from other podcasts that I loved in the past month that I think you might want to try out. You can subscribe to my newsletter by clicking on the link in the show notes or going to my website, friendlypodcastguide.com. Now we get to hear from Mr. Jim about how his bedtime stories became popular with more than just his own kids. Today we have Mr. Jim from the Kids Short Stories podcast, and holy cow, we are so excited to have you on our podcast, Mr. Jim.
I'm very excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
You are so welcome. Can you introduce yourself a little bit to my listeners?
Yes, my name is Mr. Jim, and I live in South Carolina with my wife and 3 boys. And I began this podcast journey 2.5, almost 3 years ago. And it's just been an amazing ride. I quit my corporate job last summer, went full time with this, and I love kids podcasts so much right now.
That's awesome. We at our house also love kid podcasts. We do not make one. Maybe someday my kids are wanting to start one because I have one, but I feel like I got to get this one a little more further down the road before we start another one. So can you tell us, why did you start your podcast? Why did you start Kids Short Stories?
Kids Short Stories was something my wife made me do for our kids. It was one of those great things that she made me do. I was traveling a lot for work, and our kids at the time, I think, were 2, 4, and 6. And I was always making bedtime stories up of just on the spot. Like, all right, kid, like, are we doing a pirate adventure? Are we doing a alien event, like mystery? Like, what are we doing? And I would just make up a story on the spot for them. And I started traveling a lot for work. Like I said, missing a lot of bedtimes. And my wife, Jocelyn, she would call me and say, hey, the kids miss your stories. Like I just read them 5 books, but they keep telling me they want a story. And I don't know how to do that. So you tell them a story. And so I'd step away from my customer, into the bathroom or wherever and, make up a story on the phone. And it was, we did that a few times. And Jocelyn was like, why don't you record a couple and text them to me? And so then we can just play them. So I made a voice memo on my phone, just sitting in my car, making a couple stories up. I texted her the voice memo. It would eventually get lost in the text thread. And it was, where did that thing go? Like, can you send it to me again? And so I just one day was like, hey, I'll just put them on as a podcast to house them somewhere so that you can listen to them on your phone or the kids' iPads or whatever. And that's what it was. And so I just started putting these stories on the podcast. It was just for my kids. And then people started leaving reviews. And that caught me off guard at first. I was like, Jocelyn, did you tell your friends about this? Like, who are these people? The review, my daughter loves your stories. Her name's Sophie. She loves unicorns and rainbows. Could you make a story for her? And absolutely, that sounds great. Like, thank you for the fun creative hook. I'll be able to make a bedtime story for my kids. So it just began this journey of parents kids sending in their story ideas into Kids Short Stories, where I was using those creative hooks to make a story really for my own kids' benefits of their bedtime stories. But it spread pretty quickly, and this was started the fall right before COVID. And so I think that season of kids being at home a lot, like parents were looking for these things. And so it blew up quite a bit. And so now tens of millions of downloads later, here we are.
That is so awesome. My kids are definitely some of those that love your podcast. So we have added to those downloads for sure.
Thank you.
What do you want people to get out of your podcast? Or I guess kids specifically?
I'm all for imagination. And like I grew up listening to audio stories or radio dramas or books on tape or like that kind of stuff. And audio has a really special magic, especially for kids. And it pulls in an active sense of imagination. Like they have, if they're listening, like their mind is working, putting this picture together. And I find the message of audio for kids to be a lot stickier sometimes than YouTube stuff that they're just sitting in front of staring at. I want parents and that family. I would love for this to be a together thing where the way that I tell stories or the way that I portray the messages in these things is like, I want to put parents in a really positive light in the story. There's, a lot of content for kids that it's like, oh, the silly parents that don't know really what's going on as their kids are off on an adventure. No, I'd rather have the parents like be supportive and in that story in a positive way. So a lot of the resources that we give parents, I send out emails directly to parents with some Easter egg kind of information that they get to drop to their kids, because I want the parents to join their kids' imagination. And so I'm always trying to figure out ways to do that. But that's the ultimate goal of Kid Short Stories, is promote kids' imagination and creativity and bringing the family together in that experience.
I absolutely love that. And truly right now, it's one of my kids' favorite things to do is to listen during lunch. And it really helps them to like sit still, but they get to like think about it. And so, yeah. And so we all eat lunch together and we talk about, I think we listened to one just barely about the Chuckwalla. I think it was Charles the Chuckwalla, and they were very obsessed and they were enthralled. So when I had to stop it for a second for someone to get a sandwich or something, they were like, why are you stopping it? So it's working at our house. So that's cool. Good. How would you describe the vibe of your show?
It's pretty silly. Like I have a lot of different voices and unicorn voices and fire breathing dragons and like all the stories for Kid Short Stories come from kids' imaginations. And one day it can be unicorns, and the next day it's on a treasure hunt, fight or trying to get to the treasure before the pirates are. And so like you just kind of never really know, but they're short stories. So the 10 minutes is kind of the average mark, which I've found to be really great for driving to school or like what you said, lunchtime, or you can just hop into any story and not really need to know a lot of context of what's going on beforehand and not feel like you missed out on anything.
Definitely. I love that. I feel like that's a good description. So I know this is hard, but do you have a favorite episode or maybe like a favorite character that you have for kids' short stories?
Yeah. So Kid Short Stories has kind of been this incubator, is how I think of it, of incubator of ideas. And since it is fully driven by kids' submissions, like there's thousands of submissions. But yeah, the spy world has been really fun for me to dig into, and the evil Dr. Stinky Breath, who's trying to take over the world and make it stinky. I love that guy, or like, he's a bad guy, but he Bernie. I've liked Bernie, our fire breathing dragon. There's a lot of characters that have become reoccurring because so many submissions say, hey, I want to do such and such with that character from, the episode last month. And it just becomes the recurring characters are because the kids keep submitting those names.
That's awesome. Well, that's fun. That's probably really fun for you too, to be like, hey, you like that character too? I really wanted to bring him back and now I can.
Yes.
That's awesome. Okay. So I feel like this question is obvious, but I like to ask it because a lot of my listeners are moms. Is the podcast okay for little ears?
I hope so. I hope so. No, yeah, it is. I love that I get to be every day, at home with my kids who are right now 5 to 8. And so I feel really in tune with their language and how they like interact with stories. Malachi, my middle son, he is my ultimate critic of like, if he's the judge that I trust to see like, did this story resonate or not? For moms listening, parents listening, like this is definitely geared for kids really 3 to 10. It's a pretty wide age spread, but we have a lot of fun along the way.
Definitely. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old and a 10-month-old. She's not quite ready, but I feel like it's a really good fit for them. And the 3-year-old finds funny parts, and the 5-year-old, I feel like is a little bit more like into it, but the 3-year-old loves the voices. So you've got both of them hooked. So that's good.
Yes.
Is there anything else that you want to add that we haven't touched on?
I think the biggest area for growth is that most parents are not even aware that podcasts exist for kids. Parents, if you're, listening and wondering like, what does it mean for a kid's podcast? Like it's just a new medium of audio entertainment for kids that's been around for decades and decades. Once on radio, cassette tapes, like wherever. Now it's just in podcast form, which makes it a lot more accessible for families. So, give podcasts a shot for your kids and you'll be really happy with what happens.
Definitely. I feel like kid podcasts have saved many a road trip for me. Yeah. I can turn on a kid podcast and they will stop whining almost immediately. I feel like kid podcasts are awesome. And I'm so excited to be able to share good kid podcasts with my listeners. Okay. Last question. Where can people find you?
Yeah. So our main home is heymrjim.com. That's where you can find all the different shows and content that we're doing. But if the easiest way to find these is just searching Mr. Jim, either on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever, our shows will pop up when you search for Mr. Jim.
Fabulous. And doesn't each show actually have their own website or like their own page under Hey Mr. Jim that they can get to?
Yep. Yeah. So Kid Short Stories, you can go to kidshortstories.com to get some like direct information specifically about that show. And yeah, on Hey Mr. Jim's site, each podcast has its own place, home.
Perfect. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I am really excited to get my listeners into kid podcasts because holy cow, it is such a fabulous medium to help kids use their imaginations, but in a screenless way. And I absolutely love it.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to hear about more podcasts from me, please follow or subscribe on your podcast app of choice. And here's your reminder to subscribe to my newsletter, The Friendly Podcast Recap. Talk to you soon.